The night hung heavy over the Baxter Ranch, a sprawling empire of cattle fields and weathered barns tucked into the heart of America's rural backbone. Stars hid behind thick, rolling clouds, and the air carried the sharp tang of damp earth and hay, a stillness so deep it felt like the world was holding its breath. Inside the main house, the faint glow of a single lamp flickered against the wooden walls, casting long shadows that danced like ghosts. Outside, the darkness was absolute, broken only by the occasional rustle of wine through the cornfields. It was the kind of night that made a man feel alone, even on his own land. But Rick Baxter, a wealthy 55-year-old rancher with calloused hands and a steel heart, wasn't alone, not anymore. He stood just beyond the cattle stable, boots sinking into the soft mud, the weight of his old Winchester shotgun steady in his grip. His breath came out in short, white puffs, curling into the frigid air. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chill, matting his graying hair beneath the brim of his worn Stetson hat. 30 feet ahead, a man knelt in the dirt, clutching his leg where Rick's warning shot had grazed him. Blood seeped through the intruder's torn jeans, staining the ground a dark, glistening red. The man's face twisted in pain, but his eyes, cold and unyielding, locked onto Rick's with a defiance that sent a shiver down the rancher's spine. "Who sent you?" Rick's voice cut through the night, low and guttural, like the growl of a cornered bear. The intruder coughed, a wet, ragged sound, then grinned, a crooked, bloody smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've kicked the hornet's nest, old man," he rasped, his words dripping with menace. "You think this ends with me? You're already dead, you just don't know it yet." Rick's jaw tightened, his finger hovering over the trigger. He'd spent decades building this ranch, turning a small plot into a fortune with elite Angus cattle and soybean fields that stretched to the horizon. He'd faced droughts, rustlers, and bank loans that could have broken lesser men. But this was different. This wasn't about land or money. This was personal, and it had crept into his world like a snake slithering through the grass. His eyes flicked to the stable behind him, its weathered red planks glowing faintly under the moonlight. That's where it had started, 3 little girls, blonde and fragile, sleeping in the hay among the cows. Clara, Elise, and Marina. His granddaughters. He hadn't known it then, but he knew it now, and the realization burned in his chest like a branding iron. A soft creak pulled his attention to the porch of the main house, 50 yards away. There, illuminated by the dim porch light, stood Caroline Baxter, his daughter, 28 years old, alive after 5 years of being mourned as dead. Her thin frame trembled as she clutched the 3 girls close, their small bodies pressed against her legs. Clara, the eldest by minutes, stared wide-eyed at the scene, her blonde curls tangled and wild. Elise clung to Caroline's skirt, her face buried in the fabric, while Marina, the quietest, gripped her mother's hand, her tiny fingers wrapped around a butterfly necklace that glinted faintly in the dark. That necklace, Rick's gift to Caroline on her 15th birthday, a silver pendant with red beads he'd had custom-made, was the thread tying this nightmare together. He'd thought it lost forever in the car wreck that supposedly claimed her life. Now, seeing it on Marina's neck, he felt the ground shift beneath him. "They're my grandkids," he whispered to himself, the words tasting like ash and hope all at once. Beside him, Raymond "Ray" Carter, a wiry private detective with a hawkish face and a voice like gravel, stepped forward, holding up a small object between gloved fingers. It was a camera, no bigger than a pack of cigarettes, its lens smudged with dirt and cow dung. "Found it in the water trough," Ray said, his tone clipped and urgent. "High-tech, satellite-linked. They've been watching us, Rick. From the inside out." Rick's stomach lurched. The stable, the house, the fields, his sanctuary, had been violated, turned into a stage for some unseen enemy's game. He glanced back at the intruder, who'd gone silent, his head lolling as blood loss took its toll. "Watching us for what?" Rick demanded, though he already knew the answer. "The girls." It was always about the girls. Ray knelt beside the wounded man, checking his pulse with a detached efficiency. "He's alive, but not for long if we don't get him patched up. We need answers, Rick. Who's pulling the strings? The rancher didn't respond right away. His mind raced, piecing together the chaos of the last week, the triplets in the stable, the mysterious footprints, Caroline's note begging him to protect them. He'd gone from a grieving father to a warrior in a matter of days, and now here he was, staring down a hired thug who dared to breach his land. The weight of it all pressed on his shoulders, but he stood taller, the shotgun a natural extension of his will. Tie him up, Rick ordered. We'll get what we need out of him. No one threatens my family and walks away. Caroline's voice broke the tension, soft but piercing from the porch. Dad, please, get inside. They could still be out there. Her words trembled, laced with a fear Rick hadn't heard since she was a little girl afraid of thunderstorms. He turned to her, seeing the woman she'd become, gaunt, haunted, but fierce in a way he hadn't expected. The girls huddled closer, their identical blue eyes reflecting the porch light like tiny mirrors. Clara whispered something to Elise, too quiet to hear, while Marina's gaze stayed on Rick, unblinking, as if she understood more than a 4-year-old should. He nodded at Caroline, a silent promise, I've got this. Ray dragged the intruder toward the shed, securing his wrists with a zip tie from his jacket pocket. The man groaned, muttering curses under his breath, but offered no resistance. As Ray worked, a faint hum cut through the night, a low, mechanical buzz that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Rick's head snapped up, scanning the sky. You hear that? He asked, his voice sharp. Ray paused, tilting his head. The sound grew louder, a rhythmic whirring that set Rick's nerves on edge. Drone, Ray said, dropping the intruder and pulling a flashlight from his belt. He swept the beam upward, catching a glint of metal high above the cornfield. Son of a bitch, they're still here. Rick's heart pounded as he raised the shotgun, tracking the drone's path. It hovered like a vulture, its red light blinking mockingly against the black sky. They're watching us right now, he said, his voice a mix of rage and disbelief. Ray grabbed his radio, barking orders to Jim Dawson, the ranch foreman, who'd been stationed at the back gate with 2 armed hands. Jim, get eyes on the west field, something's up there. Move. Static crackled back, then Jim's voice, on it, boss. I see lights, could be a vehicle. Rick's grip tightened. A drone, a camera, an intruder, this wasn't a random hit. This was war, and it had come to his doorstep. He turned to Caroline, who'd stepped off the porch, the girls trailing behind her like ducklings. Get them to the bunker, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Now. She nodded, scooping Marina into her arms while Clara and Elise followed, their bare feet slapping the cold ground. Rick watched them disappear into the house, the screen door slamming shut behind them. Then he faced the stable again, the place where this all began, a sanctuary turned battleground. The drone dipped lower, its hum a taunting challenge. Rick aimed, his finger itching to fire, but Ray grabbed his arm. Not yet. We need to know who's behind it. Shoot it down, and we lose the trail. Rick lowered the gun, his chest heaving. The intruder chuckled weakly from the dirt. Too late, old man. They're coming for what's theirs. Rick spun on him, kneeling so their faces were inches apart. Those girls are mine, he snarled. My blood. You tell your bosses they'll have to kill me to get them. The man's grin faded, replaced by a flicker of fear. For the first time, Rick saw weakness in those cold eyes, and it fueled him. The drone circled once more, then vanished into the night, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Rick stood, his mind racing. The necklace, the girls, Caroline's return, it was all connected, and the answers were out there, lurking in the shadows. Cliffhanger, Marina's voice echoed from the house, small but clear through the open window, Mommy said run if the man in the black cap comes. Rick froze. Who was she talking about? The Baxter Ranch lay cloaked in the stillness of midnight, a sprawling patchwork of fields and barns stretching out beneath a sky thick with storm clouds. The air hung heavy with the promise of rain, the kind that could turn dirt to mud and wash away tracks, or secrets. Inside the main house, the old grandfather clock ticked relentlessly in the hall, its pendulum swinging like a metronome counting down to something inevitable. The faint hum of crickets outside was the only sound, a fragile thread of normalcy in a night that felt anything but. Rick Baxter sat in his office, a small room off the kitchen lined with oak shelves and faded photos of better days. His weathered hands rested on the desk, one clutching a steaming mug of black coffee, the other hovering near the grip of his Winchester shotgun, propped against the chair. He hadn't slept, not really, since the girls showed up in the stable a week ago. His eyes, bloodshot and sharp, flicked to the security monitor on the desk, its grainy black and white feed showing the ranch's perimeter in eerie silence. Beside him, Ray Carter, the private detective who'd become an unlikely ally, leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his sharp features lit by the monitor's glow. Ray's denim jacket was unzipped, revealing a holstered Glock that gleamed faintly in the dim light. He'd been chain-smoking since dusk, the ashtray on the desk overflowing with stubs, the air thick with the acrid scent of tobacco. "You need to rest, Rick," Ray said, his voice a low rasp, like sandpaper on wood. "You're no good to them if you're running on fumes." Rick didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the screen. "I'll rest when this is over," he muttered. "When I know they're safe." He didn't need to say who they were: Clara, Elise, and Marina, the Triplet sisters sleeping upstairs with their mother, Caroline. His granddaughters, though he'd only learned that truth days ago. The weight of it sat on his chest like a slab of granite, heavy and unyielding. A sharp beep cut through the quiet, jolting Rick upright. The monitor flashed red, a single word blinking in the corner: West Fence motion detected. Ray dropped his cigarette, crushing it under his boot as he leaned over the desk. "Here we go," he said, his tone shifting from weary to razor-edged. Rick's heart kicked into overdrive, adrenaline surging through his veins like a shot of whiskey. He grabbed the shotgun and switched the monitor to the west camera feed. The grainy image flickered, then steadied. 3 dark figures moved through the shadows, their outlines distorted by the night but unmistakable. They wore hoods and what looked like night vision goggles, their steps deliberate and silent, like wolves stalking prey. "They're not amateurs," Ray said, narrowing his eyes. "Military-grade gear. They're here." Rick's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "They're here for the girls," he growled, the words tasting like bile. He stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor, and strode to the window overlooking the west field. The blinds were half open, giving him a sliver of a view, enough to see the faint glint of metal as one figure slipped through the barbed wire fence. "How'd they get past the sensors this long?" Rick asked, his voice tight. Ray tapped the monitor. "They didn't trip the outer ones, must have scoped the blind spots. These bastards know the layout." Rick's mind raced back to the missing ranch hand, a quiet kid named Tommy hired 10 days ago who'd vanished that afternoon. Fake name, fake papers, a plant. "We've been played," he said, slamming his fist on the desk. The coffee mug tipped, spilling dark liquid across the wood, but he didn't care. All he could see were those 3 figures creeping closer, a noose tightening around his family. Ray grabbed his radio, thumbing the button. "Jim, West Fence, 3 intruders, armed and moving fast. Get the boys ready." Static crackled, then Jim Dawson's voice came through, steady but urgent. "Copy that. We're locking the back gate now. You want us to engage?" Rick shook his head, answering for Ray. "Not yet. Let's see what they do." He needed to know their plan. Were they here to snatch the girls, plant something, or burn the place down? Every possibility twisted his gut, but he forced himself to focus. He'd spent a lifetime protecting this ranch, now it was about protecting something far more precious. Down the hall, Caroline's soft footsteps padded toward the office. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale and drawn, her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. She wore one of Rick's old flannel shirts over her pajamas, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. "Dad, what's happening?" she whispered, her voice trembling but laced with steel. Rick turned to her, seeing the little girl he'd raised and the woman who'd survived hell. "Trouble," he said simply, nodding to the monitor. Her eyes widened as she took in the feed, her hand flying to her mouth. "They found us," she breathed, stepping closer. "I knew they wouldn't stop." Rick reached out, squeezing her shoulder. "They won't get through me," he promised, his voice a rock she could cling to. Caroline nodded, then darted upstairs without another word. Rick knew where she was going, the girl's room. He'd shown her the hidden bunker earlier that day, a concrete-lined tunnel beneath the house his father had built decades ago to store grain during floods. It was cramped and musty, but it had a steel door and enough supplies for a week. If it came to it, she'd take the girls there. He pictured them now, Clara, fierce and stubborn, Elise, shy and clinging, Marina, quiet with those haunting blue eyes and the butterfly necklace that tied her to him. He'd die before letting anyone touch them. Back on the monitor, the figures split up. One veered toward the water tank near the stable, a blade flashing as he sliced through the main pipe. Water gushed out, a dark puddle spreading across the dirt. "Cutting our supply," Ray noted, his voice grim. Another figure slipped into the cattle stable, moving low and fast, while the third crept toward the house, a shadow against the cornfield. Rick's blood ran cold. "They're boxing us in," he said, swinging the shotgun over his shoulder. Ray grabbed his Glock, checking the clip with a practiced flick. "I'll take the stable. You cover the house." Before they could move, the figure in the stable emerged, planting something under the water trough, a small, black device that blinked red. "Camera," Ray hissed. "They're setting up surveillance." Rick's mind flashed to the drone they'd hear later, the pieces clicking into place. This wasn't just an attack, it was a reconnaissance mission, a prelude to something bigger. He bolted for the door, Ray on his heels, but stopped short as Caroline's voice echoed down the stairs. "Dad, they're ready." She appeared at the landing, Clara beside her holding Elisa's hand, Marina trailing with the necklace glinting. "It's a hide-and-seek game, okay?" Caroline said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Clara nodded fiercely, her small fists clenched. "I'll lead my sisters," she declared, a 4-year-old's bravery that broke Rick's heart and steeled it all at once. Rick gave her a nod, then turned to the monitor just as the third figure reached the porch steps. He raised the shotgun, aiming through the window, and fired, a deafening crack that shattered the glass and lit the night. The figure stumbled, clutching his knee, and collapsed with a scream that pierced the silence. The other two froze, then bolted into the cornfield, their shadows swallowed by the stalks. Rick stepped outside, the cold air hitting his face like a slap, and trained the gun on the fallen man. "Move, and the next one's in your chest," he barked. Ray rushed to secure him, kicking a knife from the man's hand. The ranch fell silent again, save for the intruder's ragged breathing and the distant rustle of corn. Rick glanced back at the house, where Caroline ushered the girls toward the bunker. The camera in the stable blinked on, a silent witness to their fight. Cliffhanger, Ray knelt by the prisoner, muttering, "Tommy's gone. The new kid, our mole. They've been inside all along." The sun dipped low over the Baxter Ranch, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, a fleeting beauty that did little to ease the tension coiling in Rick Baxter's gut. The day had been hot and humid, the kind of sticky heat that clung to your skin and made every breath feel like a chore. Now, as dusk settled in, a cool breeze rustled the cornfields, carrying the faint scent of hay and cattle dung from the stable. Rick stood on the porch of the main house, a weathered structure of cedar and stone that had been his family's stronghold for 3 generations. His boots thudded against the planks, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his faded jeans, his gray Stetson tipped back to reveal a furrowed brow. The ranch sprawled out before him, acres of rolling land, dotted with barns and silos, a testament to his life's work. But today, it felt less like a kingdom and more like a battlefield. Inside, the house buzzed with quiet activity. Caroline Baxter, his daughter, moved through the kitchen, her footsteps soft but purposeful as she prepared dinner for the girls, Clara, Elise, and Marina, the triplet sisters who'd turned Rick's world upside down. The clatter of pots and the murmur of their small voices drifted out through the screen door, a fragile slice of normalcy amid the storm brewing around them. Rick's eyes lingered on the stable across the yard, its red paint peeling under the weight of years. That's where he'd found them a week ago, 3 blonde girls curled up in the hay, their identical blue dresses smudged with dirt. He'd thought it a fluke then, a strange twist of fate. Now, he knew better. They were his granddaughters, and the truth of it was unraveling faster than he could keep up. The rumble of a truck broke his reverie, dust kicking up as Raymond Ray Carter pulled into the driveway. The detective climbed out, his lean frame clad in a denim jacket, a black duffel slung over one shoulder. His sharp eyes scanned the property, missing nothing, before landing on Rick. "Got something for you," Ray called, his voice cutting through the evening air as he approached the porch. He dropped the duffel with a thud and unzipped it, pulling out a small package wrapped in dark red fabric, tied with twine. It was no bigger than a loaf of bread, but the sight of it sent a chill down Rick's spine. "Delivered to the gate an hour ago," Ray said, his tone grim. "No return address, no postmark. Just your name scratched on the front." Rick took the package, his rough fingers tracing the coarse fabric. It felt heavier than it looked, like it carried more than just weight. He glanced at Ray, who nodded silently, his jaw tight. Rick untied the twine with deliberate care, peeling back the cloth to reveal a handmade doll, 3 faces sewn side by side, each with blonde yarn hair and red button eyes. The mouths were stitched in black thread, crossed like an X, a silent scream frozen in fabric. Clara, Elise, Marina, they were unmistakable. Pinned to the doll's chest was a folded note, its edges yellowed and creased. Rick's hands trembled as he unfolded it, the words scrawled in jagged ink hitting him like a punch to the gut, "You took them from me. Now I'll take your piece." Ray stepped closer, peering over Rick's shoulder. "That's a marker," he said, his voice low and steady. "Seen it before, trafficking rings use symbols like this. It's a territorial claim, a warning shot." Rick's throat tightened, his mind racing back to the footprints he'd found near the stable, the red ribbon Jim had spotted by the fence. This wasn't random, it was personal, targeted. He clutched the doll, the coarse stitches digging into his palm, and looked at Ray. "They're coming for the girls," he said, the realization settling like a stone in his chest. "My girls." Before Ray could respond, the screen door creaked open, and Caroline stepped out, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her face, pale and drawn, softened for a moment at the sight of her father, but her eyes darkened when they landed on the doll. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rick hesitated, then handed it to her, watching as her fingers brushed the fabric. She froze, her breath catching as she read the note. "Oh God," she murmured, her hand flying to her mouth. "They found us." Her eyes met Rick's, wide with a fear he hadn't seen since she was a child, but beneath it burned a fierce determination. "Dad, I need to tell you something." Rick motioned her to the porch swing, its chains groaning as they sat. Ray lingered by the railing, giving them space but staying close, his ears sharp. Caroline took a deep breath, clutching the doll like a lifeline. "I escaped," she began, her voice trembling but resolute. "5 years ago, after the girls were born. They took me, locked me in a place pretending to be a hospital. I got out, but I couldn't take them with me. I begged a nurse to bring them here, to the stable, because I knew you'd find them." She paused, tears welling in her blue eyes. "I knew you'd protect them." Rick's world tilted. He'd buried an empty urn, mourned her after a staged car wreck, spent years drowning in guilt for the fight that drove her away. Now she was here, alive, and the girls were his blood. He reached for her hand, his rough palm enveloping her trembling fingers. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked, his voice cracking with a mix of relief and pain. Caroline shook her head. "I was scared. They threatened to take them, to kill you if I came back. But I couldn't hide anymore, not after they left that note in the backpack." The backpack, Rick remembered it, a pink satchel he'd found in the girl's room days ago, stuffed with a torn diaper and her handwritten plea, "Dad, protect them." "I had to run." He'd read it a dozen times, each word carving deeper into his soul. Now, this doll was proof her pursuers had tracked her down. He pulled her into a hug, her thin frame shaking against his broad chest. "You're home now," he said, his voice a rock amidst her storm. "No one's taking them, or you, from me." Ray cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "This isn't just a threat, Rick. It's a declaration. They've been watching, planning. That doll means they're close, could be tonight." Rick released Caroline, his mind shifting from father to fighter. He stood, pacing the porch, the doll still in his hand. His eyes drifted to the girls inside, visible through the window, Clara coloring at the table, Elise stacking blocks, Marina tracing the butterfly necklace with tiny fingers. That necklace, he'd given it to Caroline on her 15th birthday, a symbol of the butterflies he'd said carried her mother's kisses from heaven. Seeing it on Marina now was like a message from the past, a tether to the family he thought he'd lost. He turned to Ray. "What's our move?" Ray rubbed his jaw, thinking fast. "We lock down, bunker the girls, arm the hands, watch the perimeter. They're testing us, seeing how we react." Rick nodded, his resolve hardening. "Then we give them a fight they won't expect." He stepped inside, calling to Caroline. "Get the girls ready, we're moving them to the tunnel tonight." She nodded, disappearing upstairs, while Rick grabbed his shotgun from the office, the weight familiar and grounding. As night fell, the ranch grew quiet, the air thick with anticipation. Rick stood guard by the window, the doll on the table beside him, its red eyes staring blankly. The phone rang, shattering the silence, a harsh, jarring sound that made his pulse spike. He picked it up, saying nothing, just listening. A deep, slow voice crackled through, "You're old, Rick. You can't outrun us." The line went dead, leaving a chill in its wake. Cliffhanger, Rick gripped the receiver, whispering to Ray, "They're coming tonight, I can feel it." The midday sun blazed over the Baxter Ranch, a relentless orb of heat that turned the air into a shimmering haze. Sweat trickled down Rick Baxter's neck, soaking the collar of his plaid shirt as he stood on the porch, squinting out at the endless stretch of his land. The ranch was a picture of rugged prosperity, golden fields of soybeans swaying in the breeze, cattle grazing lazily beyond the stable, and the faint hum of machinery from the workers tending the irrigation lines. It was the kind of day that should have felt peaceful, a reward for decades of backbreaking labor that had built this place into a small empire. But peace was a stranger now, chased off by the ghosts of the past week, 3 little girls found in his stable, a daughter he'd mourned alive again, and a creeping sense that something dark was closing in. Rick leaned against the porch railing, his gray Stetson tilted back, revealing deep lines etched into his weathered face. His hands, rough and scarred from years of roping cattle and fixing fences, gripped the wood until his knuckles whitened. Inside the house, the faint laughter of Clara, Elise, and Marina drifted out, mingling with the clink of dishes as Caroline washed up after lunch. The girls had been with him for 6 days now, their presence a bittersweet jolt to his solitary life. He'd found them in the stable, curled up in the hay like lost lambs, their blonde hair tangled and their blue dresses smudged with dirt. At first, he'd thought them runaways or abandoned, until the butterfly necklace on Marina's neck sparked a memory that stopped his heart. It was the same one he'd given Caroline on her 15th birthday, a keepsake from a happier time. Now, it dangled from a 4-year-old's neck, a silent scream that his daughter wasn't dead, and these girls were his blood. The rumble of an engine snapped him out of his thoughts. A silver pickup rolled up the dirt drive, its Washington, D.C. plates glinting in the sun, a rare sight this far from the city. Rick straightened, his hand instinctively dropping to the hunting knife sheathed at his hip. The truck stopped near the gate, and a man stepped out, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who wanted to be seen. He was tall, maybe late 40s, dressed in a crisp gray suit that looked out of place against the dusty backdrop of the ranch. Dark sunglasses hid his eyes, and a leather briefcase dangled from one hand. He adjusted his tie, flashed a practiced smile, and called out as he approached, "Mr. Richard Baxter." "Name's Mark Taylor. I'm a lawyer, mind if we have a word?" Rick's gut twisted. He didn't trust suits, especially ones showing up unannounced with fancy plates and slick grins. He stepped off the porch, boots crunching gravel, and met the man halfway, keeping a good 10 feet between them. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice gruff, arms crossing over his broad chest. Taylor's smile didn't falter, but there was a sharpness to it, like a blade wrapped in velvet. "I represent the Dignified Life Foundation," he said, his tone smooth as polished glass. "We've received a complaint, 3 minors being held here without proper registration. I'm just here to check the paperwork, make sure everything's legal. You understand, I'm sure." The words hit Rick like a slap. His eyes narrowed, a storm brewing behind them. "Held here," he repeated, his voice low and dangerous. "Those girls ain't prisoners, they're family. You got no business poking around my land." Taylor tilted his head, unfazed, and opened his briefcase, pulling out a crisp document stamped with official-looking seals. "See, that's the thing, Mr. Baxter. No birth records, no custody papers, nothing on file. We're just trying to protect the kids. I'll need to see some proof, or this could get messy." He held out the paper, but Rick didn't take it. His mind raced, someone had sent this guy, someone who knew about the girls, someone testing his defenses. Before he could respond, Raymond Ray Carter's truck rolled up, dust swirling as he parked beside the silver pickup. The detective climbed out, his lean frame taut with purpose, eyes locking onto Taylor like a hawk spotting prey. He'd been in town digging into the ranch's security breaches, the footprints, the missing worker, and his timing couldn't have been better. Ray strode over, his boots kicking up gravel, and planted himself beside Rick. "Who's this?" he asked, his voice a low growl, one hand resting casually near the Glock holstered under his jacket. Rick jerked his chin at Taylor. "Says he's a lawyer, asking about the girls." Ray's gaze sharpened, sizing Taylor up. He stepped closer, peering at the document still dangling from the man's hand. "Dignified Life Foundation, huh?" Ray said, his tone dripping with skepticism. "Funny, I ran a check on every outfit tied to child welfare in the state. That name ain't in the books. And that badge number on your card?" He nodded at the ID clipped to Taylor's suit. "Belongs to a guy in Virginia, dead 3 years." Taylor's smile flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. Rick saw it, the mask slipping, revealing something cold underneath. "Get lost," Rick snapped, stepping forward until he loomed over Taylor, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow. "And tell your boss he picked the wrong fight." His voice was a steel blade, cutting through the humid air. Taylor's lips pressed into a thin line, the charm evaporating. He snapped the briefcase shut, his movements sharp and deliberate. "You don't know who you're dealing with," he said, his voice dropping to a hiss. "This doesn't end here." He turned on his heel, strode back to the truck, and slammed the door. The engine roared to life, tires spitting gravel as he peeled out, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Rick watched until the truck vanished down the road, his fists clenched so tight his nails dug into his palms. Ray pulled out his phone, snapping a photo of the receding plates. "Cloned," he muttered after a quick check. "That wasn't a lawyer, that was a scout, measuring us up." Rick's mind churned. A fake lawyer, fake plates, someone was probing, pushing, trying to find a crack in his armor. He turned to the house, where Caroline stood at the window, her face pale as she watched the scene unfold. The girls were with her, their small figures silhouetted against the glass, Clara waving a crayon, Elise peeking shyly, Marina clutching that damn necklace. He climbed the porch steps, Ray trailing behind, and called a meeting in the kitchen. Jim Dawson, the foreman, joined them, wiping sweat from his brow with a bandana. "From now on," Rick said, his voice steady but fierce, "this ranch is a fortress. No one in or out without my say. Arm the hands, lock the gates, and check every inch of this place." Jim nodded, his weathered face grim. "I'll get the boys on it, boss." Ray added, "They're circling, Rick. That suit was a warning shot, next time, they won't ask nicely." As the men dispersed, Caroline slipped out to the porch, pulling Rick aside. "Elise had a dream last night," she said, her voice barely audible. "A bad man in a black cap, coming for us." Rick's stomach dropped. He glanced at the stable, then back at her, the necklace on Marina flashing in his mind. "We'll be ready," he said, pulling her into a quick, fierce hug. Later, as he patrolled the fence line with Jim, they found it, a red ribbon tied to a post, fluttering like a bloodstain in the wind. "Cliffhanger," Jim muttered, "that wasn't here yesterday, who the hell left it?" The Baxter Ranch shimmered under the oppressive weight of a late afternoon sun, its rays beating down on the sprawling fields like a hammer on an anvil. The air was thick with humidity, a sticky veil that clung to everything it touched, making the world feel sluggish and heavy. Dust swirled lazily in the wake of a passing tractor, its engine growling as one of Rick Baxter's ranch hands guided it toward the soybean fields. The stable stood sentinel across the yard, its red paint faded but proud, a silent witness to the chaos that had uprooted Rick's life 5 days ago. He stood on the porch of the main house, a tall figure in faded jeans and a sweat-stained plaid shirt, his gray Stetson pulled low over eyes that hadn't known real rest since the girls arrived. His hands gripped the railing, the wood warm and splintered beneath his calloused palms, as he stared out at the land he'd poured his soul into, a kingdom now teetering on the edge of a war he didn't fully understand. Inside, the house hummed with the soft sounds of life. Caroline Baxter moved through the living room, her bare feet padding against the hardwood as she folded a pile of tiny clothes, blue dresses and mismatched socks belonging to Clara, Elise, and Marina. The triplets were sprawled on a quilt near the fireplace, their blonde heads bent over a scattering of crayons and paper. Clara, the boldest, scribbled a jagged red line, while Elise traced a shaky circle, her tongue poking out in concentration. Marina sat apart, quieter, her small fingers tracing the butterfly necklace around her neck, a silver pendant with red beads Rick had given Caroline years ago, now a haunting link to a past he'd thought was buried. Their laughter, light and innocent, drifted out to him, a bittersweet melody that tightened his chest. 5 days since he'd found them in the stable, and every moment since had been a tangle of questions with no answers. The crunch of tires on gravel jolted him from his thoughts. Ray Carter's beat-up truck rolled up the drive, its engine coughing as it parked near the porch. Ray climbed out, his lean frame moving with a restless energy, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He carried a tablet under one arm, his denim jacket slung over his shoulder despite the heat. "Rick," he called, flicking the cigarette into the dirt and grinding it out with his boot. "We've got a lead, grab your hat." Rick's pulse quickened, a mix of dread and determination surging through him. He stepped off the porch, meeting Ray halfway, the dust settling around them like a gritty fog. "What did you find?" he asked, his voice rough, hands already itching to act. Ray tapped the tablet, pulling up a grainy still from a security feed. "Got this from a buddy at the Three Rivers Motel, 7 miles down the highway. Last night, 2:43 a.m., a guy checks out of room 208. No name, paid cash, but look at this." He zoomed in on the image, a figure in a dark cap and surgical mask, his posture stiff and erect, exiting a black sedan with tinted windows. The timestamp glowed in the corner, hours before sunrise. "Walks like he's ex-military," Ray said, his eyes narrowing. "Precise, controlled. Left before dawn, but the clerk said he asked about the ranch, directions, layout, the works." Rick's stomach churned. Someone had been sniffing around, close enough to touch, and he hadn't known. 3 rivers, he muttered. That's too damn close. Ray nodded, pocketing the tablet. Thought the same. I called in a favor, motel's got a working camera in the hall. Figured we'd check it out ourselves, see if we can ID this bastard. Rick didn't hesitate. Let's move, he said, grabbing his keys from the porch table. He poked his head inside, catching Caroline's eye. Heading out with Ray, keep the girls close. She nodded, her face tightening with worry, but she didn't ask questions. She'd learned to trust his instincts, just as he was learning to trust hers again. The drive to 3 Rivers was a tense blur, the truck's tires humming against the cracked asphalt of the rural highway. Rick gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, while Ray rode shotgun, scrolling through the tablet for more intel. The motel came into view just as the sun dipped below the horizon, a squat, beige building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign that read Desert Sun. A handful of cars dotted the lot, mostly beaters and a rusted RV, but the black sedan was nowhere in sight. Rick parked near the office, the engine ticking as it cooled, and followed Ray inside. The clerk, a bored kid with acne and a lip ring, barely looked up from his phone. Ray flashed a fake badge, some old PI trick, and leaned on the counter. Room 208, last night. Guy in a cap, what did he leave behind? The kid shrugged, tapping at a grimy laptop. Checked out at 6:13 a.m. Dropped the key and split, no bags, no chit-chat. Weird dude, though, kept asking about the Baxter place, like he was mapping it. Rick's blood ran cold. Ray pressed, anything else? Visitors? Calls? The clerk shook his head. Nada. Just smoked like a chimney, left the room stinking of it. Rick's mind snagged on that, cigarettes. He smoked Camels, a habit he'd picked up in his rodeo days. Too common to mean much, but it gnawed at him. Ray slipped the kid a 20 and got the key to 208. They climbed the creaky stairs, the hall dim and reeking of mildew. The room was small, bed made, trash empty, surfaces wiped, but Rick's farmer's eye caught the details. A faint ring on the desk's glass top, like a metal cup had sat there, and a single cigarette but in the ashtray, Camel, half-burned. My brand, Rick muttered, picking it up with a napkin. Ray swept a UV flashlight over the walls, revealing fluorescent traces near the bed, tape residue, maybe from a map or photos. He was planning something, Ray said, his voice tight. Memorized it, then cleaned up. He's good. Rick stood by the window, peering out at the darkening highway. He's always one step ahead, he growled, frustration boiling over. Knew about the girls, the ranch, everything. Ray joined him, pulling out his phone. Not everything. I've got the hall footage downloading, 6:13 a.m., clear shot of him leaving. Cap and mask, but the walk'll tell us something. He dialed Jim Dawson back at the ranch. Jim, check the skies, drones, anything odd. This guy's got eyes on us. Jim's voice crackled back, all quiet so far, but I'll sweep the perimeter. As they stepped outside, the motel's sodium lights buzzed to life, casting long shadows. Rick's mind drifted to Caroline. 5 years ago, pregnant and scared, she'd fought with him over raising a kid alone. He'd pushed her away, and then the accident took her, or so he'd thought. Now, she was back, the girls were his, and someone wanted them gone. The necklace on Marina's neck haunted him, a clue he couldn't shake. They climbed into the truck, the engine roaring as Rick peeled out, determination hardening his resolve. He'd find this shadow, whoever he was. Back at the ranch, Caroline tucked the girls into bed, their small forms nestled under a quilt. Clara stirred, her voice sleepy but clear. Grandpa's mad, huh? Caroline brushed her hair back. He's just keeping us safe, honey. Outside, the night deepened, and as Rick and Ray sped home, Clara sat up, pointing out the window to the hill beyond the fields. A man's up there, she whispered, her blue eyes wide. Cliffhanger, Caroline froze, peering into the dark. Nothing moved, but the hairs on her neck stood on end. The Baxter Ranch basked in the soft glow of a late morning sun, its golden light filtering through a thin haze of dust kicked up by the cattle stirring in the fields. The air carried the earthy scent of hay and manure, a familiar perfume that had grounded Rick Baxter for decades. He stood in the doorway of the main house, a sturdy figure in faded jeans and a worn plaid shirt, his gray Stetson resting on the kitchen table behind him. The porch creaked under his boots as he gazed out at the stable across the yard, its red planks weathered but resolute, a silent monument to the moment his world had shifted. 4 days ago, he'd found 3 little girls sleeping in the hay there, their blonde curls tangled and their blue dresses smudged with dirt. Clara, Elise, and Marina, names he'd only learned recently, names that now echoed in his mind like a prayer. He'd thought them lost souls then, but now he knew they were his granddaughters, and the weight of that truth pressed against his ribs like a vice. Inside, the house was a quiet haven. Caroline Baxter moved through the living room, her steps light as she tidied the chaos of the girls' morning play, crayons scattered across the coffee table, a half-built tower of wooden blocks teetering near the fireplace. The triplets were upstairs, their small voices drifting down in bursts of giggles as they played in their room. Clara's bold chatter led the pack, Elisa's shy murmurs followed, and Marina's silence punctuated it all. Her presence felt more than heard. Rick lingered in the doorway, caught between the peace within and the storm brewing outside. His hands, rough from years of roping cattle and mending fences, fidgeted with the edge of his shirt, a restless energy he couldn't shake. The girls had been here 4 days, and each one had peeled back another layer of a past he'd buried, or thought he had. He stepped into the kitchen, the linoleum cool beneath his socks, and poured himself a mug of coffee from the pot Caroline had left simmering. The steam curled upward, a fleeting comfort as he sat at the table, the mug warm against his palms. His eyes drifted to a small pink backpack slumped in the corner, a relic he'd found in the girls' room the night before, tucked behind the dresser like a secret waiting to be uncovered. He'd noticed it yesterday but hadn't touched it, too caught up in the whirlwind of their arrival. Now, with the house quiet and the ranch hands busy in the fields, curiosity, or maybe instinct, drew him to it. He set the mug down, the clink loud in the stillness, and crossed the room, kneeling to retrieve the bag. Its fabric was faded, the zipper stiff with age, but it opened with a reluctant groan, revealing a jumble of contents, a torn diaper, a crumpled sock, and a folded piece of paper tucked into a side pocket. Rick's breath hitched as he pulled the paper free, its edges worn and soft, like it had been handled 100 times. He unfolded it carefully, his rough fingers trembling as the familiar handwriting came into view, Caroline's, unmistakable even after 5 years. The words were scrawled in black ink, smudged in places as if written in haste, "Dad, if you read this, protect them. I had to run. Forgive me, Caroline." His heart stopped, a cold wave crashing over him. He read it again, then a third time, each word carving deeper into his soul. The mug on the table grew cold as he sat there, the note clutched in his hands, his mind reeling. 5 years ago, he'd lost her, or so he'd thought. A car wreck, a mangled chassis in a ravine, blood and tissue the rescue team said was hers. He'd buried an empty urn, mourned her in silence, blamed himself for the fight that drove her away. Now, this note told him she'd lived, she'd run, and these girls were hers, his. The creak of the stairs snapped him back. Caroline appeared, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her face pale but resolute. She froze in the doorway, her blue eyes locking onto the note in his hands. "Dad," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence like glass shattering. Rick stood, the chair scraping against the floor, and held up the paper. "This yours?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. She nodded, stepping closer, her hands twisting together. "I wrote it, before I left them here," she said, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't know if you'd find it, or if you'd even believe me." Rick's throat tightened, a lump he couldn't swallow. "Believe you?" he rasped. "Caroline, I buried you. 5 years, I thought you were gone. And now you're here, and these girls," he gestured upstairs, where the triplets' laughter still echoed. "They're mine, aren't they?" She nodded again, a sob escaping her lips. "They're ours, Dad. Clara, Elise, Marina, I had them after I left. I couldn't come back, not then. They were after me, after them." Rick's mind spun, the pieces clicking into place, the girls in the stable, the necklace on Marina's neck, a butterfly pendant he'd given Caroline on her 15th birthday. He'd told her then that butterflies were her mother's kisses from heaven, a story to ease the pain of loss. Now, it was a lifeline pulling him back to her. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulling her into a fierce hug, her thin frame trembling against his broad chest. "You're alive," he murmured, his voice cracking. "My girl's alive." She clung to him, tears soaking his shirt. "I'm sorry, Dad. I wanted to tell you, but I was scared. They'd have killed you to get them." He pulled back, holding her at arm's length, his eyes searching hers. "Who's they?" he demanded, fear and fury warring in his gut. She shook her head, wiping her eyes. "I don't know their names, just men, powerful men. They took me after the girls were born, locked me up. I escaped, left them in the stable because I knew you'd find them." Rick's hands balled into fists, the note crumpling in his grip. "Why the stable?" he asked, his voice low. "It was the safest place I could think of," she said, her voice steadying. "Your place, Dad. I knew you'd protect them." He nodded, the weight of her trust settling on his shoulders. He'd found them, all right, 4 days ago, their small forms huddled in the hay, a sight that had haunted him since. Now, it made sense, but it also raised 100 new questions. Who was chasing her? Why the girls? And how had they stayed hidden so long? The roar of an engine cut through the moment. Ray Carter's truck pulled up outside, dust swirling as he parked. He stepped out, his sharp eyes scanning the ranch, a phone pressed to his ear. Rick met him on the porch, Caroline trailing behind, the note still in his hand. "Ray," Rick said, holding it up. "She's alive, my daughter's alive." Ray's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't miss a beat. "Good to know, but we've got bigger problems. Got a hit on a guy sniffing around 3 Rivers, asked about the ranch last night. We need to move." Rick's stomach dropped, the note burning in his palm. "My daughter's alive," he repeated, louder, a vow as much as a statement. "And someone's coming for her kids." Caroline grabbed his arm, her voice urgent. "Dad, they won't stop. That note, I left it for you, but if they find it," Rick cut her off, his resolve hardening. "They won't touch you, or them. Not while I'm breathing." He turned to Ray. "Let's go, 3 Rivers. Now." As they headed for the truck, the girls' laughter faded upstairs, and Rick's mind locked onto one thought: he'd protect them, no matter the cost. Cliffhanger, Jim Dawson's voice crackled over Ray's radio. "Boss, found tire tracks near the back gate, fresh ones." The Baxter Ranch slumbered under the faint blush of dawn, a quiet expanse of fields and barns bathed in the pale light of a sun still creeping over the horizon. Mist clung to the soybean rows, curling around the cattle stable like ghostly fingers, softening the edges of a world that felt anything but gentle. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint tang of dew-soaked earth and the lowing of cows stirring in their pens. Rick Baxter stood at the kitchen window of the main house, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, its bitter warmth a small anchor against the tide of unease washing over him. 3 days had passed since he'd found the triplet girls in the stable, Clara, Elise, and Marina, and each sunrise since had brought more questions than answers. He wore his usual faded jeans and a flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his gray Stetson resting on the counter beside a stack of unopened mail. His eyes, shadowed from sleepless nights, traced the stable's silhouette, a red sentinel against the gray dawn. Inside, The house was still, its silence broken only by the soft creak of floorboards settling and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The girls slept upstairs, their small forms tucked into a single bed Rick had dragged from the guest room, their blonde curls spilling across the pillows like rays of light in the dark. He'd checked on them an hour ago, unable to resist the pull of their presence. Clara sprawled with abandon, Elise curled tight, Marina clutching that butterfly necklace he couldn't stop staring at. It was his, once, given to Caroline on her 15th birthday, a silver pendant with red beads he'd had made to ease her grief after her mother's death. Seeing it on Marina's neck had cracked something open in him, a wound he'd thought long healed. 5 years ago, he'd lost Caroline, or so he'd believed. A car wreck, a ravine, an empty urn buried in the town cemetery. Now, these girls were here, and he didn't know why, but he felt them in his bones, a connection he couldn't name. He turned from the window, setting the mug down with a soft clink, and shuffled to the living room. The space was a time capsule, faded floral wallpaper, a worn leather couch, photos of Caroline as a girl lining the mantel. One caught his eye, her at 15, grinning beside a birthday cake, the butterfly necklace gleaming against her collarbone. He'd told her then that butterflies were her mother's kisses from heaven, a story to soothe her tears. Now, it haunted him, a thread tying past to present he couldn't untangle. He sank onto the couch, the leather creaking under his weight, and rubbed his face with both hands. 3 days of wondering, whose kids were they? Why the stable? Why his ranch, and no answers, just a gnawing sense that something was coming, something he couldn't outrun. 5 years ago, Caroline had stood in this same room, her voice sharp with defiance. She'd been 23, pregnant, her belly just starting to show under a loose sweater. "I don't need your help, Dad," she'd snapped, her blue eyes flashing. "I can raise this kid alone." He'd argued back, his temper flaring, pride, fear, and stubbornness clashing in a storm of words. She'd wanted to keep the father a secret, some drifter she'd met on the road, and Rick had hated it, hated her silence, hated the thought of her struggling out there. She'd left that night, slamming the door, her truck peeling out of the drive. Weeks later, the sheriff called, her car found wrecked in a ravine, blood and tissue confirming the worst. No body, they'd said, the river took it. Rick had buried an urn, a symbolic goodbye, and drowned his guilt in whiskey and work. That was the story, until 3 days ago, when those girls turned it into a lie. His reverie shattered as the back door creaked open, a sliver of dawn light spilling across the floor. Caroline stepped inside, her blonde hair matted with sweat, her thin frame wrapped in a coat too big for her, Rick's old Carhartt, snatched from the mudroom. She froze when she saw him, her blue eyes wide with a mix of relief and terror. "Dad," she breathed, her voice raw, like she'd been running, or hiding. Rick shot to his feet, the mug forgotten, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Caroline," he rasped, disbelief choking the word. She was alive, gaunt, haunted, but alive, standing in his kitchen after 5 years of grief. He crossed the room in 3 strides, pulling her into a crushing hug, her trembling body pressed against his chest. "You're alive," he whispered, tears stinging his eyes. "My God, you're alive." She clung to him, her breath hitching with sobs. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "I couldn't come back, not until now." He pulled back, holding her at arm's length, his hands gripping her shoulders. "What happened?" he demanded, fear and fury warring in his gut. "The wreck, where've you been?" She wiped her eyes, her face a map of exhaustion and resolve. "It wasn't real," she said, her voice steadying. "The crash, they staged it. After the girls were born, they took me, locked me in a place pretending to be a hospital. Said I was crazy, kept me drugged. I had triplets, Clara, Elise, Marina, and they wanted them." Rick's mind reeled, the room spinning around him. "Who's they?" he asked, his voice a low growl. "Men," she said, shuddering. "Powerful men, traffickers, I think. They took us after I gave birth, said the girls were valuable. I escaped 3 days ago, got help from a nurse. She drove me here, left them in the stable because I knew you'd find them. Her eyes flicked to the stairs, where the girls slept. I couldn't take them with me, they'd have caught us. I hid, watched, made sure you found them first. The stable, Rick pictured it now, 3 small figures in the hay, the necklace on Marina's neck a beacon he hadn't understood. Why didn't you come to me, he asked, pain lacing his words. I was scared, she admitted, tears spilling again. They knew where you lived, threatened to kill you if I ran home. But I couldn't stay away anymore, not after I got free. Rick's hands balled into fists, rage boiling beneath his skin. Someone had taken his daughter, his granddaughters, turned his life into a lie, and now they were here, under his roof, a family he'd mourned and reclaimed in the same breath. He led her to the couch, sitting her down, his mind racing. You're safe now, he said, his voice a rock she could lean on. But we need help, someone to figure this out. She nodded, clutching his hand. They're still out there, Dad. They'll come for them. Rick's jaw tightened, his resolve hardening. He'd found the girls 3 days ago, a mystery dropped into his lap. Now, with Caroline's truth laid bare, it wasn't just a mystery, it was a fight. He grabbed his phone, dialing Ray Carter, the only man he trusted to untangle this mess. Ray, he said when the line picked up, get over here. My daughter's alive, and we've got trouble. As Caroline rested her head on his shoulder, the ranch settled into an uneasy quiet, the dawn light creeping higher. Rick's mind locked onto the girls upstairs, their laughter a faint echo in his ears. He'd protect them, whatever it took. Cliffhanger, from the hill beyond the fields, a stranger watched through binoculars, his cold eyes fixed on the house, a radio crackling in his hand. The Baxter Ranch stood silent under the weight of a moonless night, its fields swallowed by a darkness so thick it seemed to press against the windows of the main house. The air was cool and still, the only sound the occasional rustle of leaves in the soybean rows and the distant lowing of cattle settling in the stable. 2 days had passed since Rick Baxter found 3 little girls sleeping in that stable, Clara, Elise, and Marina, and the mystery of their arrival gnawed at him like a splinter under his skin. He sat at the kitchen table, a lone figure in the dim glow of a single bulb overhead, his gray Stetson resting beside a half-empty bottle of whiskey. The amber liquid sloshed in the glass he gripped, his calloused hands steady despite the storm raging in his mind. His flannel shirt hung open over a white undershirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing arms weathered by years of ranch work. The stable loomed in his thoughts, a red shadow beyond the window, its hay-strewn floor now a riddle he couldn't solve. The house was quiet, its usual creaks and groans muted in the late hour. Upstairs, the girls slept in the guest room, their small forms huddled under a quilt Rick had dug out of storage. He'd checked on them earlier, drawn by a need he couldn't name, Clara sprawled across the bed, Elise curled into a tight ball, Marina clutching a butterfly necklace that glinted faintly in the dark. That necklace, silver with red beads, a gift he'd given Caroline on her 15th birthday, haunted him. 5 years ago, he'd buried an empty urn for his daughter, convinced she'd died in a car wreck. Now, this pendant on a 4-year-old's neck was a crack in that story, a whisper of something he didn't dare hope for. He took a sip of whiskey, the burn grounding him, and stared at the photo on the table, Caroline at 15, smiling beside a cake, the necklace shining against her skin. Who were these girls? Why his ranch? The question spun, relentless, offering no rest. 200 miles away, in a nondescript industrial park, a different scene unfolded, one Rick couldn't see but was tied to him by threads of fate. A squat, gray building squatted behind a chain-link fence, its windows blacked out, a faded sign reading Palmas Wellness Center barely legible in the gloom. Inside, the air reeked of antiseptic and despair, a sterile facade masking a darker truth. Caroline Baxter paced a small, locked room, her blonde hair matted with sweat, her thin frame draped in a hospital gown that hung loose on her shoulders. Her blue eyes darted to the door, then the barred window, her breath shallow and quick. She was 28 now, but the years since she'd left the ranch had carved lines into her face, a map of fear and defiance. On a cot in the corner lay a crumpled note she'd written days ago, "Dad, protect them." I had to run, a plea she'd entrusted to a nurse she'd bribed with whispered promises and a stolen watch. 5 years earlier, she'd stood in Rick's kitchen, pregnant and proud, refusing his help. She'd left that night, determined to raise her child alone. Months later, in a dingy motel room, she'd given birth, not to one baby, but 3, Clara, Elise, and Marina, identical miracles born under a flickering neon light. She'd barely held them a week before the men came, dark suits, cold eyes, voices promising safety that turned to threats. They'd taken her and the girls, locked them in this place under the guise of treatment. Caroline wasn't crazy, but they'd labeled her that, drugged. Kept her in a haze while they planned something worse for her daughters. She'd overheard them, Silas Monroe, a man with a scar across his cheek and a voice like ice, barking orders about valuable assets and luxury adoption markets. The girls, with their rare triplet birth and striking looks, were a prize, a commodity to be sold to the highest bidder, wealthy families abroad willing to pay millions for a perfect set. Silas stood now in a dimly lit office down the hall, a cigarette burning between his fingers, its smoke curling toward a cracked ceiling. He was tall and wiry, his black cap pulled low, his scarred face etched with impatience. A map of the Baxter Ranch lay spread across a metal desk, red pins marking the stable, the house, the back gate. There, he muttered to a shadow in the corner, a broad-shouldered man with a military buzz cut, cradling a radio. "The nurse screwed us, dropped them at the old man's place 2 days ago." The shadow grunted, adjusting a holstered pistol. "Then we go get them. Clean sweep, girls in, witnesses out." Silas exhaled a plume of smoke, his eyes narrowing. "Not yet. We watch first, see what the rancher knows. If he digs too deep, we burn it down. No loose ends." Caroline had fought back in her own way, small rebellions, whispered plans. She'd befriended a nurse, a young woman named Lena with kind eyes and a shaky conscience. 3 days ago, under a storm that masked their steps, Caroline had slipped Lena the note and a promise, "Get them to my father's ranch, the stable. He'll find them." Lena had hesitated, then nodded, driven by guilt or pity. She'd taken the girls that night, bundled them in blankets, and driven 200 miles to the Baxter Ranch. Caroline had stayed behind, knowing she'd slow them down, praying Rick would see the necklace on Marina's neck, a clue, a lifeline. Lena had left them in the stable, their small forms hidden in the hay, and sped off into the dark, leaving Caroline to face the fallout. In the locked room, Caroline pressed her ear to the door, catching fragments of Silas's voice, "Ranch, watch, burn." Her heart pounded, a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She'd escaped the drugs that day, faking compliance, spitting pills into her sleeve. Her mind was clear now, sharp with purpose. She had to get out, get to Rick, warn him. The window was barred, the door bolted, but she'd seen Lena slip a key under the cot, a final act of defiance before disappearing. Caroline knelt, her fingers trembling as she retrieved it, the metal cold against her skin. She stood, resolve hardening her features, and moved to the door, her breath held as the key turned with a faint click. Back at the ranch, Rick poured another shot of whiskey, the bottle nearly empty, his mind a tangle of grief and suspicion. He didn't know Caroline was alive, didn't know she'd sent the girls to him, didn't know the stable was a drop point in a desperate escape. He only knew they were here, 3 blonde angels with no past he could trace, and that necklace on Marina's neck was a ghost he couldn't shake. He stood, staggering slightly, and shuffled to the window, peering out at the stable. 2 days ago, he'd found them there, a sight that had stopped his heart, Clara's bold stare, Elisa's shy curl, Marina's quiet gaze. He'd called the sheriff, kept it quiet, but the questions burned. Who left them? Why? In Palmas, Caroline slipped into the hall, her bare feet silent on the tile, her pulse racing as she dodged a guard's flashlight beam. She didn't know if Lena had made it, if the girls were safe, but she clung to the hope of Rick, his strength, his stubborn love. Silas's voice echoed behind her, "Burn it down," a threat she couldn't outrun. She reached a side exit, the night air hitting her face like a slap, and ran, her coat flapping, her mind fixed on the ranch. Cliffhanger, Silas turned to the shadow, crushing his cigarette. "Send a man to the hill, watch the old bastard. If he moves, we strike." The Baxter Ranch shimmered under the oppressive heat of a late summer morning, the sun a relentless glare that baked the earth and turned the air into a thick, humid soup. The field stretched out in golden waves, soybeans rippling in a faint breeze, while the cattle stable stood like a weathered fortress, its red paint chipped and peeling under years of wear. Dust hung in the air, kicked up by the slow shuffle of cows moving toward the water troughs, their lowing a lazy chorus that blended with the hum of cicadas. Rick Baxter trudged across the yard, his boots crunching against the dry gravel, a battered thermos of coffee dangling from one hand. His faded jeans were streaked with dirt, his plaid shirt open over a sweat-soaked undershirt, and his gray Stetson sat low over eyes shadowed by fatigue. At 55, he was a man carved from the land, broad-shouldered, rough-hewn, a rancher who'd turned a small plot into a thriving empire through grit and stubborn will. But today, that strength felt hollow, a shell worn thin by years of solitude. The main house loomed behind him, a cedar and stone relic of better times, its porch sagging under the weight of memory. 5 years ago, he'd stood in that kitchen, arguing with Caroline, his only daughter, 23 and pregnant, her blue eyes flashing with defiance. "I don't need you hovering, Dad," she'd snapped, her voice cutting through the still air. "I can do this alone." He'd pushed back, his temper flaring, pride and fear warring in his chest. She'd refused to name the father, some drifter she'd met on the road, and Rick had hated it, hated her secrecy, hated the thought of her out there, vulnerable. She'd stormed out that night, her truck roaring down the drive, leaving a silence that settled into his bones. Weeks later, the sheriff called, her car found wrecked in a ravine, blood and tissue painting a grim picture. No body, just an empty urn he'd buried in the town cemetery, a gravestone he visited every Sunday with a bottle of whiskey and a guilt he couldn't drown. That was his life now, work, whiskey, and the ghosts of what he'd lost. He reached the stable, the double doors creaking as he pushed them open, the familiar scent of hay and manure washing over him. The cows stirred, their heavy bodies shifting in the stalls, but something felt off, a stillness that prickled the hairs on his neck. He set the thermos on a barrel, wiping sweat from his brow, and started his morning rounds, checking the feed bins and water lines. The routine was muscle memory, a rhythm that kept him sane, but as he moved deeper into the stable, a faint sound stopped him cold, a soft, muffled whimper, like a calf caught in a fence. He turned, his eyes scanning the shadows, his hand dropping to the hunting knife at his hip. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough and low, echoing off the wooden beams. No answer, just that whimper again, softer now, coming from the back corner where the hay bales were stacked. Rick stepped forward, his boots scuffing the dirt floor, his pulse ticking up a notch. The stable was his domain, no one came here without his say, not the hands, not the neighbors. He rounded a stall, the light filtering through cracked slats casting jagged stripes across the hay, and froze. There, nestled in a hollow between two bales, were three small figures, girls, no more than 4 years old, their blonde curls tangled with straw, their blue dresses smudged with dirt. They lay curled together, a tangle of limbs and soft breaths, their faces flushed with sleep or heat. Clara, the boldest, sprawled on her back, one arm flung out, Elise curled tight beside her, a fist pressed to her mouth. Marina lay still, her tiny hand clutching a silver necklace that glinted faintly, a butterfly pendant with red beads. Rick's breath caught, his heart slamming against his ribs. "What the hell?" he muttered, kneeling beside them, his rough hands hovering, unsure. They were alive, breathing, warm, real, but who were they? How had they gotten here? He scanned the stable, half expecting someone to step out, a parent or a prankster, but it was empty, the cows his only witnesses. He reached out, brushing Clara's hair back, and she stirred, her blue eyes fluttering open. She stared at him, unafraid, her gaze sharp and clear. "Where's Mommy?" she asked, her voice small but steady, cutting through the silence like a blade. Rick's throat tightened, a flood of questions choking him. "I don't know, kid," he said, his voice softer than he meant it to be. "How'd you get here?" Clara sat up, nudging Elise awake, who whimpered and clung to her sister. Marina stayed still, her eyes opening slowly, locking onto Rick with a quiet intensity that unnerved him. That necklace, it was Caroline's, the one he'd given her on her 15th birthday, a memory of butterflies and her mother's kisses from heaven. He'd thought it lost in the wreck, buried with her. Now, it dangled from this girl's neck, a ghost from the past staring him in the face. "Who left you here?" he pressed, his tone urgent now, but Clara just shrugged, rubbing her eyes. "A lady," she said. She said to wait. He stood, his mind racing, the stable spinning around him. 3 girls, identical, blonde, blue-eyed, dropped in his stable like a gift or a curse. He didn't know their names yet, didn't know they were Clara, Elise, and Marina, didn't know they were his granddaughters. All he knew was the necklace, a tether to Caroline he couldn't ignore. He scooped Marina into his arms, she was light, fragile, her warmth seeping into his chest, and grabbed Clara's hand, guiding Elise beside her. "Come on," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his head. "Let's get you inside." They followed, their small feet shuffling through the hay, their trust in him immediate and unsettling. The house was cool and dim as he led them in, setting Marina on the couch, Clara and Elise climbing up beside her. He grabbed his phone, dialing Jim Dawson, his foreman. "Jim, get over here," he barked when the line picked up. "Found 3 kids in the stable, girls, little ones. No idea where they came from." Jim's voice crackled back, surprised but calm, "On my way, boss." "You call the sheriff?" Rick hesitated, glancing at the girls, Clara coloring the couch with a stray crayon she'd found, Elise sucking her thumb, Marina watching him with those haunting eyes. "Not yet," he said. "Just get here." He hung up, his gaze drifting to the necklace again, his heart pounding with a hope he didn't dare name. He poured them water from the sink, their small hands clutching the glasses, and sat across from them, the kitchen table a barrier he didn't know how to cross. "Who's the lady?" he asked again, softer now, but Clara just sipped her water, her lips pursed. "She drove us," she said finally. "Said it's safe here." Rick leaned back, the chair creaking, his mind a tangle of disbelief and suspicion. Safe here, his ranch, a fortress he'd built with his own hands, now a refuge for strangers who weren't strangers at all. He didn't know it yet, didn't know Caroline was alive, didn't know she'd sent them, but the necklace burned in his vision, a clue he couldn't shake. Outside, the ranch settled into its morning rhythm, the hands moving through their tasks, oblivious to the shift inside. Rick watched the girls, their presence a mystery wrapped in innocence, and felt the weight of something bigger closing in. Cliffhanger, as Jim's truck rumbled up the drive, Rick stepped outside, scanning the stable, and spotted fresh footprints in the dirt near the doors, too small for his boots, too deliberate to ignore. The Baxter Ranch lay cloaked in the suffocating darkness of a moonless night, its sprawling fields and barns swallowed by shadows that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and hay, a faint breeze rustling the cornfields like whispers of warning. Inside the main house, the faint glow of a single lamp flickered against the wooden walls, casting jagged shadows that danced across the room. Richard "Rick" Baxter stood just beyond the cattle stable, his boots sinking into the soft mud, the Winchester shotgun a steady weight in his hands. His gray Stetson sat crooked on his head, sweat matting his graying hair despite the chill that clung to the night. His breath came in short, white puffs, curling into the frigid air, each one a testament to the fire burning in his chest, a mix of rage, fear, and a fierce, unyielding love that had been reborn in the chaos of the past week. 30 feet ahead, a man knelt in the dirt, clutching his leg where Rick's warning shot had torn through flesh and denim. Blood seeped into the ground, a dark, glistening pool that reflected the faint starlight breaking through the clouds. The intruder's face twisted in pain, his cold eyes locked onto Rick's with a defiance that sent a shiver down the rancher's spine. "Who sent you?" Rick growled, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade, low and guttural, a sound born of decades protecting what was his. The man coughed, a wet, ragged noise, then grinned, a crooked, bloody smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You've kicked the hornet's nest, old man," he rasped, his words dripping with menace. "You think this ends with me? You're already dead, you just don't know it yet." Rick's finger hovered over the trigger, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He'd built this ranch from nothing, faced down droughts and rustlers, but this was different, this was war, and it was personal. His eyes flicked to the porch 50 yards away, where Caroline Baxter stood, her thin frame trembling as she clutched her triplet daughters, Clara, Elise, and Marina, close. The porch light cast a halo around them, illuminating their small, fragile forms against the night. Clara, bold and fierce at 4, stared wide-eyed at the scene, her blonde curls wild and tangled. Elise clung to Caroline's skirt, her face buried in the fabric, a soft whimper escaping her lips. Marina, the quietest, gripped her mother's hand, her tiny fingers wrapped around the butterfly necklace that glinted faintly, a silver pendant with red beads Rick had given Caroline on her 15th birthday, now a symbol of a family he'd thought lost forever. "They're my grandkids," he whispered to himself, the words a vow etched into his soul, tasting of ash and hope intertwined. Beside him, Raymond, Ray, Carter, the private detective who'd become his shadow, held up a small camera pulled from the water trough, its lens smudged with dirt and dung. "They've been watching us," Ray said, his voice clipped and urgent, his hawkish face taut with focus. "High-tech, satellite-linked, inside job." Rick's stomach lurched, the realization sinking in, the stable, the house, his sanctuary, all violated by unseen eyes. He glanced at the intruder, now silent, his head lolling as blood loss took its toll. "Watching for what?" Rick demanded, though he knew, Clara, Elise, Marina, the triplets dropped into his life 7 days ago, a mystery that had unraveled into this moment. It had started with the stable, 7 days back, under a humid morning sun, when he'd found them curled in the hay, their blue dresses smudged, their blonde curls tangled. Clara's bold stare, Elise's shy curl, Marina's quiet gaze with that necklace, they'd stopped his heart, a riddle he couldn't solve. 5 years of mourning Caroline, believing her dead in a wreck, had shattered when she stumbled into his kitchen 3 days later, alive and haunted, her story spilling out, kidnapped, locked away, her girls sent to him as a desperate plea. The note in the pink backpack, "Dad, protect them." I had to run, had confirmed it, and now here they were, facing the enemy head-on. Caroline's voice cut through the tension, soft but piercing from the porch. "Dad, please, get inside. They could still be out there." Her words trembled, laced with a fear Rick hadn't heard since she was a child, but beneath it was a strength he admired. He turned to her, seeing the woman she'd become, gaunt, fierce, a mother who'd fought hell to save her daughters. "Get them to the bunker," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for debate. She nodded, scooping Marina into her arms, Clara and Elise trailing behind, their bare feet slapping the cold ground as they vanished into the house. Rick watched the screen door slam shut, a silent promise echoing in his mind, "I'll keep you safe." Ray dragged the intruder toward the shed, zip-tying his wrists with a flick of efficiency, the man groaning but offering no fight. "We'll get answers," Ray muttered, kicking a knife from the man's reach. "But this ain't the end." Rick nodded, his mind tracing the threads, Tommy, the missing ranch hand, a mole, the red ribbon on the fence, the doll with 3 faces, the fake lawyer, Taylor, the cigarette butt in room 208 at 3 Rivers. It all led here, to this night, to Silas Monroe's cold voice plotting from 200 miles away, "Burn it down." Caroline had escaped him, sent the girls to the stable, a place she'd known since childhood, a fortress she trusted Rick to defend. A faint hum broke the silence, a low, mechanical buzz that grew louder, setting Rick's nerves on edge. "Drone," Ray hissed, sweeping a flashlight upward, catching a glint of metal above the cornfield. Rick raised the shotgun, tracking its path, the red light blinking like a taunting eye. "They're still here," he said, rage boiling beneath his calm. Ray grabbed his arm. "Not yet, shoot it, and we lose the trail." Rick lowered the gun, his chest heaving, the drone dipping low before vanishing into the night. He turned to the intruder, kneeling close, their faces inches apart. "Those girls are mine," he snarled. "My blood. Tell your bosses they'll have to kill me first." The man's grin faded, a flicker of fear breaking through his mask. Caroline reappeared at the window, her voice soft through the glass. "I left them in the stable because it was the safest place I knew," she said, her eyes locked on Rick's. "Your place, Dad." He nodded, the weight of her trust anchoring him. 7 days ago, he'd found them there, Clara's question, "Where's Mommy?" echoing in his ears, the necklace on Marina's neck a clue he hadn't understood. Now, it was clear, Caroline had sent them, a mother's desperate gamble, and he'd answered without knowing, pulling them from the hay into his arms, into his life. The ranch fell silent, the drone's hum gone, the intruder subdued. Rick stood, his shotgun steady, his mind racing through the week, the stable, the footprints, Caroline's return, the threats piling up. He'd built this place with his hands, a legacy of sweat and stubbornness, but now it was more, a shield for his family, a line in the dirt he'd die to hold. "I'll protect them with my life," he vowed, his voice a low rumble, a promise to Caroline, to the girls, to himself. Ray clapped his shoulder, radio crackling with Jim's voice, "Westfield's clear, boss, no lights." But Rick knew it wasn't over, Silas was out there, watching, waiting. Cliffhanger, Marina's voice floated from the house, small but clear through the open window, "Mommy said run if the man in the black cap comes." Rick froze, his eyes darting to the hill beyond the fields, nothing moved, but the night felt alive, watching back.